5. Hounded. Sir Alexander remained behind in the village when their late lunch was finished. Kipling, Beresford and Dunsterville reluctantly took their leave. Dr. Martinson shook the hands of the doctor and Doyle before heading back to his own home to finish the death certificate on Tolliver. That left only Doyle to accompany the doctor and Sarah back to Fulbright Hall. As the coach ambled through the countryside, Sarah turned to the doctor. "Is any of this becoming clearer to you?" she asked. "Not really," he answered cheerfully. He had slouched down in his seat, the brim of his deerstalker pulled down over his eyes, in an attempt to make it look as though he was sleeping. Sarah knew him too well to believe this ruse, and knew that he was merely attempting to avoid answering any questions she or Doyle might have. "Do you have any idea what is going on here?" she persisted. "I always have ideas," he answered somberly. "But until I have more information, I'm not going to share them. If we can capture this beast tonight, then I'll be able to be more specific. Until then, all I have is theories." Doyle shifted eagerly in his own seat, opposite Sarah. "What is this monstrous hound like?" he asked. "Like a monstrous hound," she answered. "It's huge, and its mouth is filled with razor-sharp fangs. It's like nothing I've ever seen on Earth before." "Intriguing," Doyle mused. "An unearthly hound, eh? Sounds like the perfect idea for a story." Sarah couldn't hide a smile. "Believe me, it is." She gave one of the doctor's knees a poke. "Oi! You going to be like this all the way back?" "Yes, and probably much later," the doctor muttered through his hat. "I'm sure you can amuse yourself until the hunt." "I'm sure I'll have to," Sarah answered. He was in his usual taciturn mood again, and she knew he was feverishly thinking through what they had discovered so far, as well as planning their evening's escapades. She chatted pleasantly with Doyle about his adventures on the whaler and his plans to enter private practice when he returned to Edinburgh. As the coach rolled to a halt outside Fulbright Hall, Sarah was startled to see Sir Edward come running down the steps, his face ashen. Ignoring the footman's offered hand, she jumped down to the gravel. "What's wrong?" she asked. "It's Alice," he said. "One of the servants found her in her room unconscious. I hope that the doctor might be able to explain." Doyle and the doctor virtually leaped from the landau, Doyle clutching his medical bag. "I'm a doctor, sir," he said briskly. "I'd be happy to offer my opinion." "Thank you," said Sir Edward gratefully. "This way." He led the three of them up to Alice's room. Roger was there, wringing his hands helplessly, as was one of the serving maids, presumably the girl who had discovered Alice. It took Doyle and the doctor a very brief time to come to the same conclusion. "She's been drugged," Doyle explained. "The effects should wear off in a short while, and leave her with no ill effects." "Drugged?" her father exclaimed aghast. "But who would do such a thing?" The doctor glanced around the room. "Offhand," he suggested, "I'd suspect the one person missing from this picture. Which is Colonel Ross's room?" Roger gave a strangled cry. "You can't think that Edmund would possibly—" "I can, and I do," the doctor snapped. "He's a very secretive person, and he's conspicuous by his absence." "But he's my friend," protested Roger. I'm sure you're a blithering idiot," Sir Edmund grunted. "Come along, Doctor. I've long said that the man is a scoundrel. Let's take a look in his room." Sarah was torn for a moment between staying to look after Alice, who she rather liked, and keeping up with the action. Action won, and she gave Doyle a quick wave before diving after the doctor and Sir Edward. Ross's room was further down the corridor, past the one Sarah had been given. Sir Edward rapped hard on the door and then threw it open. "Nobody here," he reported, disappointed. But his bags are, the doctor said, going to his knees in front of the first. He didn't touch it until he had conducted a thorough examination of the straps. "Aha!" he exclaimed happily. "Just as I expected." Taking his magnifying glass from his pocket, he held up the strap using the handle. Sarah saw the glint of something in the leather. Ingenious. He's booby-trapped it so that anyone who opens his bags unaware gets drugged. Sarah frowned. "So you're saying that Alice was trying to rummage through his things?" "It looks that way," the doctor agreed. "She was obviously suspicious of his motives and wanted some information." His eyes sparkled. "I wonder why Ross felt it necessary to rig this kind of trap for his bags. It's hardly the action of an honest man, is it?" "The man's a scoundrel," repeated Sir Edward. "I should have Faversham arrest him." "On what charge?" asked the doctor. "He hasn't actually done anything criminal that we know of, and the only way your daughter could have been injected is if she were burgling his trunk. I think we'd be better off leaving the constable out of this." "But we have to do something," protested Fulbright. Sarah jerked her head at the two trunks. "He won't go too far without his luggage, will he?" she said. "Their rig suggests there's stuff in there he needs." She looked down at the doctor. "You going to open them up?" He shook his head. "I don't think so. There may be other traps, and I doubt Ross would have left anything terribly incriminating behind. Let's just wait for him to turn up again, shall we?" "So now what?" Getting back to his feet, the doctor slipped his glass back into his pocket. "Rest," he suggested. "We'll need all our energies and wits tonight when the sun goes down." The hunger in his stomach almost overcame the fear in his soul. Waiting in the ancient mine for the sun to go down taxed him almost beyond endurance. He tried to sleep, but hunger continually wakened him. It was only the certainty that if he ventured out in the daylight, then he might as well just kill himself that kept himself from throwing aside caution and padding out onto the moors. The wind had risen, whipping at the grasses and sparse shrubs, bringing to his sensitive nostrils the scents of life. He could almost taste the prey in his mouth, feel the blood pulsing in their furry bodies, hear their bones snap as he bit down. He whimpered in agonizing indecision, desperately wanting to feed, but terrified of the consequences. He had not asked for this fate, didn't deserve it. Why was he so tortured and so afflicted? He stared down at the paws he now possessed instead of hands. They were much more powerful in some ways than his old hands had been. He could kill with a single blow, and the claws he possessed could rip through branches, bone, or flesh. But he couldn't hold a pencil. And his mouth, the fangs he had grown, were capable of ripping the throat out of a horse. But he had lost the ability to speak. All he could manage were the whimperings he was now producing, or the growls, barks, and howls that he gave vent to in the night. Despite all of that, he knew that he had been human once, a long, long time ago. Now, what was he? Neither man nor beast, but some terrible, cruel mixture of the two, twin natures that could never intermix as his physical forms had done. He wanted to howl out his pain, his fear, and his rage, but he knew that would bring the hunters to him faster. One day he was sure they would kill him. One day, perhaps, he would get some peace in the arms of death. He wasn't afraid of that so much. Death would be welcome, though he would never actively seek it. What terrified him the most was that he might not be killed. He'd been human once. He knew what people would do with him if they ever captured him. Worse, he knew what Ross would do if he found him. This was all because of Ross in the first place. Had it not been for the man, he wouldn't be in this state. He would still be human. If he was doomed to die, he'd die happily if he could only kill the man who had done this to him. He envisioned fastening his fangs into Ross's throat and shaking the man like a rat until his spine cracked, his skull split, and he could eat the fiend's brains for a final meal. Then they could kill him. But he knew that he was fooling himself. There was no chance that Ross would give him the opportunity for vengeance. Ross was too smart for that. He'd have others out to do his work. The hunters would be others, either brought by Ross or else fooled into doing his black deeds. Hunger gnawed at his insides again, and he whimpered once more. He stopped pacing up and down in the confines of the tunnel and stared at the darkening sky. It would be twilight in an hour, and then he could venture out. In the darkness, he knew, he could give any human the slip. All he needed to do was to kill, quickly and silently, the first prey he came across. And if it was a hunter? A human? Well, so much the worse for that man, then. He had only wished to be left alone, and the men with their guns wouldn't allow him to live. So be it. If there was to be a confrontation, he would not shy from killing. And, though the thought was repugnant, his stomach insisted that good food could not be wasted. "Has it come to this?" he agonized. "Am I really considering cannibalism?" But was it cannibalism? He had been human once, but he was not human now, and could never be again. He'd take animal flesh if he could, and he was more animal than human now. If that was right, how could it be wrong to feast on the flesh of those who would kill him? He resolved that he would kill whatever prey came to him first, man or beast. And he knew that he would eat anything that was presented to him. He settled down to await the setting of the sun. Then the hunt would begin. Alice joined the rest of them in the dining room for an early supper, though she didn't eat much. She insisted that she was feeling much better, but appeared pale and still tired, despite her long enforced rest. Roger fussed over her, and her father appeared much relieved. Sarah could see that Sir Edward was genuinely fond of his daughter. Despite his somewhat gruff manner, she realised that Fulbright was actually quite a pleasant person. He became much more animated with the reappearance of Alice. After they had eaten, he led them all onto the patio overlooking the back lawns and the beautiful fountain. Sipping at her wine, Sarah found it very relaxing to be here. It was difficult to turn her mind to the evening's activities. She simply wanted to sit out here and enjoy the cool of the dying afternoon. Despite the rising breeze, it wasn't uncomfortable at all. "I've arranged for the grooms to prepare 4 horses for us," Sir Edward told the doctor. "I take it you can ride?" "Naturally," the doctor answered. He looked satiated. Considering how much of the supper he had packed away, Sarah reflected, he should. And so can Sarah. "Miss Smith?" Sir Edward stared from her to the doctor. "I assure you, sir, this is no expedition for a woman." "And I assure you," the doctor retorted before Sarah could start her own protest, "that I would sooner have Sarah beside me than any 3 men. I know I can rely on her implicitly." "Thank you," Sarah said, touched by his compliment. He wasn't often that generous with his praise. "But it's not right," spluttered Sir Edward. "You'd better accept that I'm coming," Sarah told him. She turned to Alice. "I hope I can borrow a pair of riding trousers, though." Sir Edward almost had apoplexy. "Men's clothing? What is this world coming to?" Alice patted his hand. "Don't be so old-fashioned, Papa," she said. I'm quite sure that Sarah and the doctor know what they are doing. And a dress is so impractical for a hunt, isn't it? She smiled wistfully. If I were not so weak, I'd want to come along as well. Never, her father vowed. Then he sighed. Oh, very well. I suppose I have no choice but to agree. He took a swig of his own brandy. I'd better have them ready 5 horses, I suppose. 4 should be sufficient, the doctor replied. I think it would be better for Roger to stay here and look after Alice. Here, I say, Bridewell exclaimed. I'm jolly well coming if she is. I can handle a gun. Probably not as well as Sarah, the doctor informed him. Anyway, I aim to capture the creature, not blow its brains out. He gave Bridewell a wide grin. Besides, if your friend Ross reappears, I think it would be better for you to be here to question him. Don't you? If Ross turns up, Alice promised, I shall make certain he is here when you return, if I have to sit on top of him. Sir Edward sighed. What is this world coming to? Women shooting and hunting, and now my own daughter talking about getting into a fight. He shook his head. That's what comes of living in a country ruled by a queen, I suppose. Sarah laughed. Cheer up, she told him. You may grow to like it. She turned to Bridewell. Please do as the doctor suggests, she begged. She wasn't sure why, but she had a definite suspicion that the doctor was simply trying to get rid of Roger. Oh, very well, Bridewell agreed with a sigh. He took Alice's hand. I wish I were coming along, though. It sounds like such sport. Alice laughed. I promise, Roger, you won't be bored in my company. Time for you to change, Sarah, the doctor observed. Then meet us at the stables. By the time you're ready, we can set off for the moors. I say, exclaimed Doyle, draining his glass, this is jolly exciting, isn't it? The best is yet to come, the doctor promised. After she had changed, Sarah hurried down to the stables. Sir Edward gave her an askance look, but didn't comment on the trousers and jacket she was now wearing. Instead, he simply handed her a rifle. You can really use this, he asked. Want to see me try? Asked Sarah cheekily. No, he answered, managing a slight smile. I suppose I am rather too hidebound, aren't I? To be honest, she told him, I think you're doing pretty well, all told. She accepted the reins of a rather fine mare. She's beautiful, aren't you, girl? Sarah patted the mare's nose and slipped the rifle into the boot on the saddle. She mounted the horse and rode over to where the doctor was waiting. You didn't want Roger along, did you? She asked softly. No, he agreed just as quietly. I think our friend Colonel Ross may turn up, and I'm not sure whose side our Mr. Bridewell would take. I preferred not to have him make a choice. Besides, he added with a grin, what could he do that you can't? Not a lot, laughed Sarah. Sir Edward rode over, and one of the grooms handed them all dark lanterns and matches. Right, the aristocrat said. I think we're ready. Now, stay close to me. The moors are considerably more dangerous than they might appear, and twice as bad at night. There are marshes and bogs that undoubtedly contain several bodies, and I'd be happy if we didn't add any more. I'll drink to that, Sarah muttered. The thought of being sucked to her death at the bottom of a bog was discomforting, but she intended to see this through. Sir Edward nodded, then turned to the doctor. As I promised, Doctor, I'll give you your chance to capture this beast alive. But if it looks like any of us are in danger, or that the creature will escape, I aim to shoot it down like the animal it is. I trust you can accept those terms. You're being more than fair, the doctor answered. I am certain that we won't be in danger from this creature, but if there is trouble, then I won't hesitate to kill it either." "Excellent." Sir Edward gave them all a tight smile. "Then let us be off." Sarah fell in behind him as they filed out of the stables and down the riding path. There was a slight queasiness in her stomach that she knew was nerves. While she had faced greater troubles beside the doctor, not least of which being the all-too-recent hunt for Morbius on the devastated surface of Karn, there was always something indescribably eerie about the unknown on Earth. She was fairly sure that the doctor knew what he was doing, but there was always the knowledge that he also had a habit of messing up rather badly from time to time. She could only hope that this wasn't one of those times. The ride was pleasant, with the setting sun tinting the woodland landscape in rich autumn colours. The wind was getting colder, however, as the sun paused on the horizon before bidding them all good night. Sarah shivered, and knew that only part of this was due to the chill. The path led them out onto the moors proper, and it was as bleak and raw a landscape as any that even Karn could have offered. Grasses and stunted shrubs were littered haphazardly across the moors, but the soil over the base rocks was too thin to support much growth. What little that struggled to survive had to compete with the winds that seemed eager to hurl any growths away. In the gathering gloom, the pathside pools and swampy areas were little more than patches of black in the grey landscape. Sarah could see why the locals so fervently believed that this was a landscape carved by the devil himself, and that the forces of evil walked about here when honest folks were warm and safe abed. Given her choice, that was where Sarah would have been by now, but she couldn't desert the doctor when he might have needed of her. She glanced at Doyle, who seemed to be enjoying this adventure. It was a long time since she had read his Hound of the Baskervilles, but she had recalled enough details to know that at least part of what he was experiencing this night would end up in the novel. Was the creature they were after the basis for the Hound itself? Doyle had credited a local friend with the source of the legend, but perhaps that was to cover up his involvement in this strange hunt. She knew that none of his biographies had ever mentioned this stay over in Devon, nor had they mentioned his meeting with the young Kipling. But, as Sarah well knew, history was merely what posterity chose to record, and not necessarily what had actually occurred. The night pressed in close about them. There was the sound of an owl hooting in the distance, but few other signs of life. Sarah knew that deer lived out on the moors, as well as the hardy local ponies. There were smaller animals too, like hares and foxes, and no doubt plenty of mice to tempt the owls. Plus, there was the monster that they were after, whatever it might be. They rode in silence. Sarah kept her eyes darting about, but there was less and less to see. Bizarre rock formations melted into the darkness, and the weird, twisted stumps of trees ceased to stand out against the black sky. There was no moon again, probably because of clouds, since there were few stars glittering either. It was like riding on the far side of the moon, far from any life at all. After a while, Sir Edward gestured to a side path. "That should take us close to where we lost the creature last night," he said softly. "We'll have to camp out once we reach the bogs and wait. I daren't take us further." "It will come to us," the doctor informed him. "The poor creature is most likely starving. It must take a great deal of fresh meat to keep a beast that size alive." "Good." Sir Edward snapped his reins, and his steed slowly took the side path. Sarah's mare shied slightly, nickering a soft protest. It could probably smell the spore of the creature they were after. Sarah gently insisted that it stay on the path, and the horse reluctantly obeyed. The feeling of oppression grew stronger in Sarah now, along with a horrible feeling that there were eyes out in the darkness watching her. She tried to shrug the impression off as being just a case of the jitters, but it wouldn't leave. If there was any basis in fact to it, it had to be just some wary animal out there. It couldn't be the monster, could it? After another 10 minutes or so, Sir Edward halted. Sarah could barely see him on his steed now, the night was so dark. "This is as far as I dare go," he called softly. "We'd better leave the horses here." Sarah slid off her mare and tied its reins to one of the twisted trees. The mare whinnied softly, then settled down as Sarah rubbed its nose. "Easy, girl," she murmured. "Everything's fine." She drew her rifle, though, and felt comforted holding it. Stepping out, she fell in with the doctor, Doyle, and Fulbright. Together they moved further into the darkness. A moment or so later, the aristocrat signalled a halt. The doctor nodded and bent to examine the ground. There was a rasp of a match and the barest flicker of a flame in his cupped hands as he looked around. Then he blew out the light. "It's not emerged yet," he reported, almost inaudibly. "Positions." Sarah nodded. Ahead was the mire, and behind the pathway leading back to their mounts. Around were the tumbled remains of boulders. She moved to one of them, which was an outcropping of cold stone about 10 feet tall. She settled down on the flattish portion and composed her mind to wait. There were soft sounds about her as the other three took their positions, and then silence. How long would they be here? Sarah was very alert right now, but she knew that the edge would be taken off her wits if the wait was too long. Still, if the doctor was right, their target would be out as soon as it felt safe. Would it sense them? At least the wind was such that it would carry their scent away from the creature, so it wouldn't have that as a warning. To pass the time, Sarah tried making sense of what they had discovered so far. What connection could there be between grave robbers, giant dogs, and monsters at sea that killed lone fishermen? What was Ross's role in all of this, and how did Breckinridge fit in? Or was he no more than an innocent party? What about the whaler, and the business its captain had in town? Try as she might, there was only one connection she could see, that this monster they hunted and the one that had killed Tolliver were hardly naturally occurring species for these parts. The doctor had mentioned something about their quarry being evolutionarily odd. Was it possible that someone here had brought creatures from the deep past or future into the local area? She and the doctor had encountered examples of temporal interference before, so she couldn't rule out the idea completely. If the monsters weren't from some other time, then just what was their origin? If she could only... She froze, blanking out her mind. In the darkness, from the direction of the mire, she'd heard the sound of splashing water. Hardly daring to breathe, she concentrated all her attention on her hearing. Had it been some nocturnal bird, or an animal, or was it the hound? For long seconds she heard nothing more. Then came the rustle of something moving in the darkness. Her throat went dry and her palms went wet. She wiped her hand slowly and carefully on her trouser leg, and then gripped the rifle. It could well be the beast. She tried to see something, anything, in the darkness, but there was no use. Aside from a few jumbled shapes of the rocks, she could make out nothing. There was the sound of another footfall, and then a vagueness in the rocks. It was the creature. Then there was a sudden movement to one side. The beast was poised to run, to attack. And then the doctor's voice broke the stillness. "Sit!" His best Barbara Woodhouse impression. Sarah almost laughed with giddy relief and shock at the silliness of the command. But the creature thumped to the ground. There was the glare of a match, and then she saw the doctor holding up his dark lantern, its soft light cast over the eerie scene. She gasped as she saw the beast, which hunched down, shaking, eyes darting about the clearing. It was a dog, but not any kind of canine she'd ever imagined. Her startled glimpse of the creature as it had jumped over her the previous night had not been incorrect, but it had been incomplete. Sitting, it was still as tall as she was, its massive head staring straight at the doctor's grin-flecked face. It was covered in shaggy fur, tangled and matted, dark in colour. Teeth glittered in the glow of the doctor's lantern, but the creature made no move to attack him. But it was the eyes that captivated Sarah. Large, expressive, and filled with pain, sorrow, and fear. And, despite everything, not the eyes of some dumb animal. There were definite signs of intelligence within them. "Lord," breathed Doyle, "that's a creature from the pits of hell itself." His hand was shaking on the rifle he held. "No," said the doctor softly. "You're a good boy, aren't you?" He reached up and scratched the monster under the chin. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a large, cold pork cutlet. "Here we are, then." He held it out to the beast. Sarah held her breath, expecting the creature to take the doctor's arm with it. Instead, it gingerly set its teeth about the meat and then gulped the offering down. It looked at the doctor, eager for more. "As I said," the doctor told his companions without looking around, "he's as gentle as a lamb if handled properly. There's no need to harm him, is there?" "I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it," said Sir Edward, still shaken by what he was witnessing. "This is utterly extraordinary." It certainly was, Sarah reflected. They were all standing about the creature now, the doctor having returned to scratching its head as if the thing were a lapdog. "What is it?" she demanded. "I'm not entirely certain," the doctor replied, "but it's no more a dog than I am." "It seems intelligent to me," Sarah observed. She gave the beast an encouraging smile. "Who's a good boy then, eh?" She nervously reached out and patted its snout. The animal used its huge tongue to gently lick her fingers. Sarah couldn't help giggling as she shook her hand to get rid of the drool. "He's a friendly chap," she commented. "Yes." The doctor stared at the creature darkly. "I don't like its existence one little bit. There's something very odd about it." Then something changed. The beast suddenly sprang to its feet, its long snout twitching as if some scent had caught its attention. A low, savage growl seemed to roll out from the back of its throat, and its hackles started to rise. Sarah gasped and stepped back. The doctor whipped around, holding up his lantern. The beast exploded into action. A huge paw slammed Sarah out of the way as it sprang past her. She whirled around, crashing painfully to the ground, and saw only a jumble of images. There was Colonel Ross, caught in the glare of the doctor's lantern beam. There was the beast, fangs bared, snarling and leaping. A soft "ft," and she was aware that something Ross had been holding had been dropped, and Ross was gone. The monster fell, the growl changing to a cry of agony that ended in the gurgling of blood and a choking sound. Then silence before a veritable storm of sound. "I'll get the blackguard!" Doyle yelled, jumping forward. "No, man!" cried Sir Edward, gripping his arm and dragging him back. "You'll only get lost in the dark and stumble into some pit." There was the sound of the horses whinnying in fear and shock, and of Ross's footsteps fading into the night. And there was the doctor, kneeling beside the fallen beast, its head cradled in his arms. "He didn't have to do this," he said, his voice filled with anger and pain. Doyle held out a hand and helped Sarah to her feet. "Are you all right?" he asked, worried. "Only bruised and winded," Sarah assured him, grimacing as she flexed her foot and stood on it. "I felt better, but I felt worse too." She limped over to the doctor and the fallen monster. She could see that half of the creature's chest seemed to have exploded, and blood was oozing out over the dirty fur. Bubbles showed that the lungs, and probably the heart, had been punctured. It was quite clearly dead. Sarah felt a pang of sorrow, but she could see there was much more in the doctor's heart. "There's nothing you can do," she said softly. "There's plenty I can do," he replied grimly. He let the dead beast's head settle down to the ground and wiped its blood off onto the fur. His eyes held a dangerous glimmer in them as he stood up. "I want to know what Ross was up to," he said coldly. "He came here specifically to kill the poor thing." "But what did he use?" asked Doyle, bewildered. "I didn't hear a shot." "It was a rather powerful air rifle," the doctor answered, virtually silent. "The weapon of an assassin, not a hunter. He didn't count on my hearing him, and obviously expected to kill and escape before we knew what was happening." "Was it one of us he was aiming at?" asked Fulbright, shocked. "I know he's a scoundrel, but I didn't think he'd stoop that low." "No," the doctor answered. "He aimed at the creature. Ross is obviously too good a shot to have been after anything else. He hit it through the heart as it moved. A difficult shot in the daylight, but almost impossible in this light. If I didn't abhor what he's done so much, I'd have to admire his skill." Sarah couldn't quite grasp what the doctor was talking about. "You mean Ross came here to deliberately kill that monster?" "Yes." The doctor stared at her thoughtfully. "I think he knew exactly what this poor beast was, and this is why he was staying at Fulbright Hall. He's connected to this travesty of nature rather intimately. He's going to have some questions to answer when I catch up with him, and I'll take great delight in beating the replies out of him." Fulbright stared down at the dead creature. "Well, Doctor, one way or the other, our work here is done. The poor thing is dead, and there will be no more killings." "Done?" The doctor looked at him as if he were insane. "It's hardly begun." He gestured down at the body. "We have something very solid to work on now. I aim to perform an autopsy in the morning to see what this actually is." "I'd be happy to help in any way I can," Doyle said eagerly. "Good." The doctor sat down on a rock. "I think that the best thing that you can do right now is all go back to the hall and get a good night's sleep. I'll stay here and keep watch over the body. First thing in the morning, Sir Edward, I'd appreciate your returning with a cart large enough to carry this back to the hall, and then lending me somewhere I can dissect it." The aristocrat looked surprised, but then nodded. "As you wish, Doctor. Your ideas have been good so far." "And what about me?" asked Sarah. "What am I supposed to do while you're up to your armpits in monster intestines?" "You have to go and see Breckinridge, remember?" the doctor reminded her. "I want you to take a good look at the factory of his. Make sure it really is manufacturing cables." "And not monsters, eh?" Sarah grinned. "Should be a doddle." In the morning, when Sarah went down to breakfast, she discovered Alice was feeling much better. Bridewell was very subdued, however, and Sarah realised he was probably trying to reconcile Ross's actions with their supposed friendship. Sarah wasn't content to let him stew. She wasn't surprised to discover that Sir Edward and Doyle had both left at the crack of dawn with several servants and a cart to collect the slain monster. As he had promised, Sir Alexander arrived after breakfast was over. He had his own carriage and horsemen, and had secured access to Breckenridge, as he had promised. Sarah was very grateful and happy to have his company for the grand tour of the factory. On the trip out, the magistrate spent the time talking about his family and the local gossip. Sarah was content to allow him to chatter on. She couldn't help wondering what might turn up at the factory. There was a different man on the gate this morning, a heavier, duller-looking individual. As soon as he saw Sir Alexander Cromwell, he unlocked the gate and opened it. Very different from her last visit. It was amazing what money and influence could do. The journey from the gate to the main door was a short one. The factory was one main building of several stories, with a cluster of a dozen or so smaller box-shaped constructions about it. Sarah assumed that they were storage sheds. There was a side entrance, presumably for the local workers to enter by, and a rather impressive large front doorway. Its two huge oak doors were open, and Sarah could see a short entrance hall beyond. Sir Alexander insisted on helping her from the carriage, and she linked arms with him to walk up the short flight of steps to the doors. As they entered the small hallway, Sarah saw it was lined with glass cases showing the various forms of sizes of wires and cables the factory produced. To her surprise, the hallway was illuminated not by softly hissing gas lamps such as were used at the hall, but by glowing electrical lamps. "I wasn't aware that electrical lighting was commercially feasible yet," she commented to Sir Alexander. "It isn't," a voice said from a doorway. Sarah saw a tall, angular man emerge, his face illuminated by a wide smile. He was dressed conservatively but neatly, in a dark suit and with a dark tie over a white shirt. Small pince-nez glasses were perched on his thin nose, and mild blue eyes peered at her through them. His hair was dark, tinged with grey at the temples, thinning and swept back, showing a high forehead. "I'm Tobias Breckenridge," he said, extending a hand. "You must be Miss Smith, who was so eager to visit me yesterday." "Sarah Jane," Sarah replied, shaking his hand. "I'm pleased you agreed to show me around." "I'm very proud of what I have accomplished here," he answered. "Sir Alexander has been very supportive of my work, and I do believe that I have latched on to the wave of the future." "Like the lighting?" asked Sarah, gesturing at the lamps. "Quite." Breckenridge's eyes glimmered as he stared at the closest. "Incandescent lamps. The invention just last year of the American Thomas Edison," he blinked. "Have you heard of him?" "Thomas Alva Edison?" Sarah grinned. "Who hasn't? A genius, they say." "I suspect they say it with great accuracy." He waved his hand about. "This factory would not have been possible without some of Edison's inventions. We are on the boundaries of science here, Miss Smith. I have an even dozen of his bipolar generators hard at work here. They power most of my machinery. Come, allow me to show you around." "I've seen this before, Tobias," the magistrate interrupted, "and my legs aren't up to this as they used to be. Would you mind if I sat this out?" "Of course not, Sir Alexander," the factory owner said smoothly. "I'll have my secretary bring you fresh tea." "Dashed decent of you," Sir Alexander smiled at Sarah. "I'm sure you'll learn a few things on this tour. Most interesting. I wish I were up to it myself." "Thanks." Sarah turned to Breckenridge. "I'm absolutely fascinated. Please, tell me all." "Certainly." He gestured for her to walk with him down the short corridor. "It's very gratifying to discover a person of your age and sex who is interested in such mundane matters as my humble factory." He opened the door ahead of them and ushered her through. "Don't be so modest, Mr. Breckenridge," she replied. "This may be a factory, but it certainly isn't humble. You are, as you say, on the cutting edge of science here, and I'm fascinated by science. My colleague, the doctor, is constantly teaching me about it." The noise level had increased here, and Sarah saw that they had emerged onto the main floor of the building. There were large vats with smoke and steam rising from them. Trolleys on wheels ran from these vats across the floor to what looked like large lathes and presses. Beyond those, other machines were whirring and chuffing away, spinning threads into cables. There were almost 100 men hard at work down here, Sarah estimated. Apart from brief glances, none of them stopped working as they passed. "The vats are where we load the raw materials," Breckinridge explained. "We import iron and other metals mostly from the Midlands. I'm thinking of installing a railway line out here to bring them faster than the ships and carriages can at the moment. We get through quite an amount of iron, as I'm sure you can imagine. It's melted down in the vats. Next, we check the purity of the mix and add whatever small trace metals are needed for conductivity. Then, the resultant mix is extruded through the next batch of machines. There, it is pressed into wire of uniform thickness and purity before being cooled and wound onto those large spools that you see. Some of these are simply shipped off. We have a large storage area at the back, and we continually receive and send supplies." "And the rest of the machines?" asked Sarah, pointing to the far end of the floor. "There we spin and weave cables, Miss Smith," Breckinridge explained. "They are corded together in bundles for carrying electrical impulses. I'd take you down to the floor, but it is important to maintain safety. Besides your own, I am, of course, concerned with that of my men." He gave her a smile. "A lady as pretty as yourself might distract them from their labours, and inattention can be dangerous, if not fatal." "I wouldn't want to cause trouble," Sarah assured him. "Thank you," Breckinridge gestured to a door beside them. "This leads to the stairs to the next level, if you would care to." "Try and stop me," Sarah said cheerfully. She opened the door and started off up the stairs. Breckinridge followed her up. They emerged into a short corridor, and when they closed the stairwell door behind them, the sound of the lower-level machinery was much diminished. This floor contained such dull but essential departments as the accountants, the shipping clerks, and the laboratories, the owner explained. "Laboratories?" Sarah asked. "You do research here, then?" Breckinridge laughed. "Don't I wish? I am certain that we English could duplicate and surpass the achievements of Edison, given half the chance. After all, scientific method was mostly born in this country. Davy, Boyle, Kelvin, and so forth. No, the laboratories are mostly to check samples of the cable for accuracy and conductive properties, that kind of thing. You could take a look in if you wish, but you'd most likely find it rather boring." "I'll take your word for it, Mr. Breckinridge." Was he being honest, or simply trying to divert her attention? Sarah wasn't absolutely sure what to make of the man. He appeared to be open and honest, and he certainly had a winning way about him. But was this merely illusion to cover some hidden depths? Or was she searching for clues to something that didn't in fact exist? "Is this everything?" "By no means." Breckinridge's eyes sparkled. "There is the final floor. I think you might well enjoy that. Come along." He led her past the wooden and smoked glass doors leading to the dull areas and to another door. As Sarah had expected, there was a further staircase beyond. "Have you ever thought of installing elevators?" she asked. "It had occurred to me," he replied, "but hydraulic elevators are not as efficient as they might be. I hear that our American cousins are experimenting with electrically powered models. I am certain that they will soon become practical, and then I shall certainly install them. Until that time, alas, we have to endure the omnipresent stairs." Sarah nodded and followed him up to another door. This was locked, and Breckinridge removed the key on a chain from his waistcoat pocket. "This is my private part of the factory," he explained. "This is where I come when I wish to relax or to cogitate." Throwing open the door, he gestured her to precede him. Inside, Sarah was impressed. It was a single large room that must have spanned about a third of the entire floor. There was a gentle hum of machinery and the sound of water splashing gently, but it was otherwise quite serene. Large aquarium tanks lined the walls everywhere except by the windows. Inside the tanks swam all manner of species of fish. Sarah recognised a few of the species, but many were strange to her. Some of them were clearly foreign. She stared at Breckenridge in respect. "An impressive collection of species," she observed, nodding at one tank. "Is that a sand shark?" "It is indeed." His eyes lit up. "You are an admirer of fish?" he asked hopefully. "Mostly with chips, I'm afraid," Sarah admitted. "But I realise this is a most impressive collection. Is this your hobby?" "More of an obsession, I'm afraid," he admitted, like a boy with a guilty secret. "And a fairly recent one, too. I began to study the oceans when I considered the laying of a telephonic cable to the continental United States. As I studied, marine life began to fascinate me. I've made a small fortune from my manufacturing plants here and in London, and was able to indulge my curiosity." He gestured her over to the windows. "I often stand here and simply stare out." Sarah emulated him, and saw that from this vantage point the bay was visible. She could see the waves on the surface of the grey waters, and from time to time spume flying as the waves crashed against the rocks in the water. It really was very pleasant in this lofty perch. "Is that why you met with Captain Grey?" she asked. "Does he supply you with some of these samples?" Breckenridge appeared surprised. "You know about the captain?" "His ship surgeon Doyle is helping my friend, the doctor," Sarah explained. "He mentioned that the captain had business with you, that's all." "Ah, I see." Breckenridge shook his head. "No, the captain does not bring live specimens back, I'm afraid. I met with him to offer him a job. I wish to finance my own cable-laying ship, and the good captain would be a perfect choice to skipper such a vessel. But, alas, I shall have to search elsewhere. Captain Grey is wedded to his love of whaling, it appears. I tried to convince him that whaling cannot last much longer, but he wouldn't listen. He knows that there are probably less than 300 Greenland whales still in those waters, but seemed impervious to suggestions that the whaling should at least pause for a while to allow their numbers to be replenished. A terrible shame." "Quite." Sarah was amazed at his enlightened attitude. "One day I'm sure more people will feel as you do. Perhaps then the whalers can be put out of action. I only hope it's soon, Miss Smith." Sarah stared out of the window at the sea. So far, Breckenridge appeared to have been very honest and straightforward. She could see why men like Sir Alexander Cromwell and Sir Edward Fulbright were taken with him. This was the age of progress, and Breckenridge seemed poised to take advantage of it. A movement in the yard some 80 feet below caught her eyes. Several small figures were moving about between the small outbuildings. "Are they children down there?" she asked, unbelieving. Breckenridge frowned at the tone in her voice. "Yes, we have several dozen of them working here." He gave Sarah a penetrating gaze. "Ah, I take it that you're a supporter of Mandela's Act, and think that all children should be in school, not in work." "I am indeed," said Sarah firmly. "I can sympathise with that point of view, Miss Smith," Breckenridge answered. "But I don't actually agree with it, especially in these cases. You have to understand that the children you see down there are happy to work here." "I'll just bet they are," Sarah said sarcastically. That made him irritated. "I see no cause for such animosity," he snapped. "Most of those children have lost their fathers at sea. They often have younger brothers and sisters dependent on them. Without the wages they earn here, they and their families might well all perish, and this nonsense about sending them to school wouldn't keep them alive. I feel that what I am doing here is helping them, not harming them." Sarah realised that she was projecting ideas 100 years in advance of their time on Breckenridge. It was unfair to judge him by the light of her era, when he was doing what he believed to be right. "I'm sorry," she apologised. "It was rude of me to criticise you in that tone." She stared down at the sad little figures in the courtyard below. Nevertheless, I do feel that they would be better off being educated than worked. And if the law passes, Breckinridge said, we may well get to discover which of us is correct. You believe they will be helped, I believe they will simply avoid going, and many will become transients upon the city streets, as they were before I helped them. Until then, perhaps we could declare a truce. Of course, agreed Sarah. She smiled. I believe you're wrong, but I admit that you are sincere, and I have to admire you for doing what you believe is right. Breckinridge was mollified. Good. And I admire your outspokenness, Miss Smith, for a cause you obviously believe in. Now, would you like tea and sandwiches with our truce, or would you prefer to see more? A cup of tea would be marvellous. Excellent. He gestured toward the door. Shall we go? Thankfully, Sir Alexander didn't press her for details on the way back. Sarah was lost in her thoughts, unable to decide how she felt about Breckinridge, and whether he was merely a factory owner or something more sinister. She couldn't help wishing he'd seemed less idealistic and more exploitive. Then she'd have been happy to consider him the enemy. As it was, she simply couldn't decide. He had apparently shown her everything at the factory. She had peeked in at the laboratories on the way downstairs, but they had seemed to be exactly the kind of thing he'd described. He'd even allowed her to look around the yard and chat to a couple of the children without interference, which strongly suggested that he was hiding nothing. And the two young boys she'd spoken to had been grateful for their jobs as messengers and carriers at the factory. As Breckinridge had claimed, they were orphans who were supporting siblings with their wages. Sarah sighed. It was so appealing to see the factory owner as a slave-driving villain, but the reality didn't resemble the prejudice much. He was enlightened and far-sighted. His schemes were all well within his grasp, and he showed a vivid certainty about the future that Sarah knew from experience was based in fact. And yet, he was unknown in her age. She couldn't understand this. He should be dominating the field within 5 years, and yet he was destined for obscurity somehow. Why? How come he had never achieved his dreams of world-spanning communications? It was going to happen, and Breckinridge should have been there on the ground floor. He was prepared to seize the opportunity. Something was obviously going to go badly wrong for him. But what? And could it be that she and the doctor might be in a position to prevent it? She had often wondered what she would do if she were faced with the possibility of altering the past. Travelling in the TARDIS rendered such a thought more than academic. On her very first trip in the TARDIS, for example, she'd gone back to the Middle Ages. One change there could have affected the whole course of history. Now, here she was again, this time in Victorian England. She had met and was interacting with two of the most famous English writers of their day, Arthur Conan Doyle and Rudyard Kipling. A little nudge from her, the wrong word even, and their lives could be altered. And while it might not change the entire course of history if Kipling never wrote the Jungle Book, say, something was bound to be affected. It was a tremendous responsibility to rest on her shoulders. She could see why the Time Lords, the mysterious race behind the Doctor's past, strongly forbade interference in the history of other worlds, though even they would meddle if they felt it was justified. They'd tried to destroy the Daleks at their birth, for example. There was no use looking for trouble, though. As far as she knew, there wasn't much chance that she and the Doctor would change history. None of what they were doing now had ever made it into any history she'd ever heard of. At the moment, it seemed that the most they were doing was influencing a couple of authors by providing them with plot materials. Hardly earth-shaking stuff. On the other hand, there was something very wrong going on here. She'd bet her life on that. Sea monsters and giant hounds were even more out of place here than she was. But was Breckinridge involved in this or not? He did have a fascination with the sea, but that wasn't necessarily an indicator of any kind. His own explanation for it was sufficient. However, she found his excuse for meeting Captain Grey to be a bit thin. Why offer the skipper of a whaling ship the job of running a cable-laying boat? Still, real life often did have thin threads of logic to it, and she might just be being a bit too suspicious here. The problem was, she reflected, that life was never as tidy and neat as it tended to be on the telly or in a book. In fiction, all plot points were relevant, and everything tied up neatly at the end to make sense. In real life, events often simply happened, with no rhyme or reason, and resolutions either never came, or passed so fast you could miss them if you blinked. Maybe Breckenridge was nothing more than he seemed, a man of vision and integrity. And maybe this was nothing but a mask that concealed a darker nature. She still had no real clue either way. All she could hope was that she and the doctor could compare notes, and that some enlightenment would come from it all. The carriage drew up at Fulbright Hall, and Sir Alexander smiled at her. "I trust you enjoyed your visit, my dear?" "Very much, thank you." Sarah shook his hand. "You were super, Sir Alexander, and I really appreciate your help." "Any time, young lady," he winked. "It never hurts my reputation to be seen out driving with a pretty woman. Scandalizes the neighbourhood, you know. Let's be certain to set tongues wagging again, eh?" "It's a date," Sarah promised with a laugh. The groom helped her down from the carriage. "Bye, Sir Alexander." "Goodbye, my dear." He waved his driver on, and the carriage pulled away. Sarah went up to the door, which was opened by a footman. "Any idea where the doctor and Dr. Doyle are?" she asked him. "I believe they're in one of the outhouses, ma'am," the groom answered. "If you wish to find them, take the path to the rear of the house, and then ask one of the gardeners." "Thanks, Jeeves." She gave him a grin and hurried to follow his instructions. At the rear of the house, one of the locals was raking leaves and pointed her in the right direction. After a few minutes, she could smell the tang of formaldehyde in the air and a sickly stench of decay. The rest of the journey was obvious. The door to the small shed was open wide to provide some ventilation. One of the servants stood upwind of the shed, looking uncomfortable, while inside the hut were the doctor and Doyle. "So," asked Sarah, "made any great discoveries?" "Indeed we have," said the doctor. His voice was tinged with anger and worry. "It's been a most productive morning." He gestured at the remains of the carcass on the trestle table behind him. "Do you have any idea what that is?" "Morbius's reject heap?" she guessed. "You're very close, Sarah," the doctor replied. "That isn't any known animal at all. In fact, it isn't even an animal." "Then what is it?" The doctor's eyes were haunted. "Off the cuff, I'd say it's a 10-year-old boy." "What?" Sarah couldn't believe her ears. "What do you mean?" "I mean, someone is tampering with the fabric of the human cell," the doctor said darkly, "perverting its secrets to their own purposes."